trying to work out what it all meant. Since then, we've done lots of kind of usability testing with people with disabilities, accessibility audits. Since then, user experience has become, a big thing, and accessibility has sort of grown along with that. Um, in around 2008, 9, I joined, well, we as a company joined W3C, and I joined the authoring tools group, which is kind of a subsection of the accessibility group, working on content management systems and everything that sort of creates content. What are the guidelines that those tools should have? So that was kind of my first step in. And then that sort of wrapped up when the Authoring Tools Guidelines 2.0 was released. And I moved over to the General Accessibility Guidelines Working Group after lots of work and discussions and gargantuan email threads. They asked me to join as the co-chair. So I joined Andrew Kirkpatrick at the time, and now there's three of us. My sort of very close colleagues, Rochelle and Chuck, and the three of us are the sort of co-chairs and editors of the guidelines now. And I just popped up. I found the first ever version that I could find of our website from 2001, and that's it. We were very proud of it at the time. It had curves, all done with CSS, no tables used. And if anyone is wondering, Mensa is the Latin for table, and we were going in for tableless design in 2001. So I felt we were kind of ahead of the pack at that stage. So I wanted to cover a few things today, starting off with where did the guidelines come from? Because a lot of people don't generally know this. The organization is the World Wide Web Consortium, started by Tim Berners-Lee, I think in the sort of early to mid 90s. It was a little bit after the web was invented, and then he started off the consortium. You may vaguely remember him from the 2012 Olympics when he was in that funky house and the house lifted up, and that was him typing away. And in the late 90s, there was a bit of a problem from an accessibility point of view. So the members of W3C are, some of the big tech organizations you might know, like Microsoft and Adobe and Apple and those sorts of organizations. And they were realizing that different countries around the world were starting to try and come up with sort of accessibility requirements, guidelines, regulations. And there was no central place. And, these are all international companies, and they wanted one place for these things to come together instead of having, different accessibility guidelines in Europe compared to America, for example. So W3C started looking at it. And they considered the ecosystem, so not just web content, but they were thinking about authoring tools, user agents is a big part of that ecosystem as well. What do the browsers and assistive technologies do? And one of the reasons this is really important for accessibility is because testing with user agents can get rather difficult. I mean, everyone's aware of, the general browsers. In those days, Internet Explorer was in the mix. And even cross-browser testing can get tricky. But when you consider assistive technologies as well, that gets really hard because you've got all sorts of mixes of things that people can use. The browser impacts it. If you're using a screen reader, you might also be using that with voice input, and it gets really complicated. And really designing to user agents really doesn't work very well because if you might be aware, if you're a developer or you're producing some sort of content and you test it in Chrome, because that's what you happen to use, if it then doesn't work in everything else, you kind of blame everything else rather than maybe it was a Chrome problem. So this kind of cross-browser, cross-user agent testing would take so much time to do in any kind of practical sense. So the guidelines, particularly the web content guidelines, were intended to be, this is what you as an author of web content need to understand. And then the user agents should be doing their bit. It's kind of a social contract almost between these different areas. So where did the web content guidelines come from? Usability testing, surveys, research. There are plenty of people with disabilities in the working group, so it was also kind of personal experience as well. But there is a filter. So because these are supposed to be kind of almost universal web content guidelines, there has to be some feasible way of implementing, of successfully sort of meeting the requirements. It has to apply across technologies. It's not just HTML, it's PDF. In the old days, we had Flash and Silverlight to worry about. So now we have EPUB. Don't tend to veer into the sort of native apps arena at the moment, but that is something that other people are trying to fill in as well. So it needs to apply across these different technologies. So you can't have a guideline that you can't meet in one of those technologies. And it also needs to apply across websites. So from personal blogs through to pretty much gaming sites or, your Amazon's, really complicated big sites. So these things have to work across all those situations and it kind of filters things out. So there are some things that would be great from a disabled user's point of view, but if we can't, the bottom line is when things get used in regulations, people can get sued for not doing something. So it's really quite a high bar in terms of you can't set an unreasonable thing for people to do and then get sued over, because that then sort of undermines the guidelines, because then businesses will push back and say, look, this just isn't reasonable. Then the regulators don't take them on and it all kind of collapses in on itself. So it's a very sort of careful stakeholder process that we have to go through in order to get guidelines published. In terms of who it's for, as part of working on WCAG 3, we went through an exercise of trying to work out all the different roles that might be interested or use the guidelines. And, I think there was 30, 31, 32 different roles that we came up with. But primarily, it's people like designers, developers, testers, and content creators, which is a really wide set of people. Um, so that's who it's for, but then it's also used by people like regulators to say these are the requirements for people who are content creators to apply. So another seemingly simple thing, but gets more complicated, is what is a content guideline? Um, I try and think of the guidelines as kind of like antibodies that are latching on to poor interface features. So poor color contrast might be one of the things we're trying to prevent. Inappropriate structure is another one, and they have a particular shape and a particular scope. And we're trying to scope the guideline to find that thing and not find other things. So we don't want to fail things that aren't problems, basically. So that's where a lot of the scoping comes in, and we go through gathering lots of examples and making sure that the wording of the guideline attacks the right thing, and doesn't catch other things. A simple way of approaching it would be almost like a user approach to say, well, as a user, if I'm using a screen reader, I should be able to navigate by headings and use lists when those things are appropriate to be used. Um, Unfortunately, that then puts quite a high requirement onto the content author to know how those things work, know how screen readers work. So certainly in the sort of 2.0 through all the 2. Series, it takes a more, and you could say more difficult to understand approach of saying things like, information structure and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined. So that's saying if something looks like a heading, make sure it's marked up as a heading. It achieves the same goal. It's not necessarily as clear, but it actually puts less of a burden on the person trying to meet the guidelines to know how to do that, particularly with all the associated documentation. So if you do dive into the guidelines, they're organized around 4 principles. Within those principles, we've got 13 guidelines. And maybe I've done this, I might need to update this. I think it's now more than 78 success criteria. So I think we've got about 50, D6 at A and double A, which are it's the sort of usual standard used by government and business for which ones. And then the AAA ones tend to be more aspirational, and we tend to use those as we do kind of a review of the AAA guidelines to say, are there any here which, we can use and can meet? But the success criteria, the core of it are essentially testable statements about web content that is known to improve access for people with disabilities. Um, that makes the guidelines good for some things and not for others. We get a lot of questions around how do I get my organization to do this? How do I persuade people to do certain things? Those tend to be the questions I get towards the end of the presentation. So I'm going to try and tackle those a bit earlier. So another thing you can think about beyond the guidelines is kind of maturity models. And I'm sure people have come across the standard ones, as an organization, pick a topic, could be security, could be something else. And you start off as sort of informal, you define things, you make those things repeatable, and then it becomes more managed, and then you start optimizing. So you sort of got this ladder of how mature is your organization? I've got slightly different headings for these. I tend to find organizations tend to start off with they don't know what they don't know. Accessibility is so low in terms of awareness that they don't even know about accessibility, except maybe in some small pockets. Then you get to a stage where a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. You might have one or two people really sort of campaigning hard, but the decisions might go in odd directions. Then people learn a bit more and they're sort of started going through an accessibility process, but they start getting overwhelmed because there's just so much to do, particularly in higher education context. But if you get there and you've got your sort of backlog out the way and you start integrating things, I think that's a sort of a much more manageable from a personal point of view point at which to get to. And then Zen, pretty rare, but it's where people tend to be kind of leading the pack, discovering new things in accessibility. And I kind of use this almost as a bit of a myth busting exercise, because if you're in that kind of don't know what I don't know stage, you get situations like, well, we've got our outsourced developers, we ask them to meet this thing called WCAG. So it must be accessible, right? The problem is people tend to sort of hire an agency for a project. It's all in the procurement. They require WCAG. The project happens, it gets released, then they get a complaint. And it's like, oh, well, did you test it? No. Did they test it? No. And nobody actually really knew what they were doing or what it meant to kind of meet WCAG. So the lack of awareness on both sides of that contract just meant it didn't really happen. And I see this a lot because it gets into contracts that people don't know what they're asking for, and the other people see it so often it's like crying wolf, it never gets tested, so they don't worry about it. There's also, I come across, well, we use this lovely new shiny framework, that will mean it's accessible. Unfortunately not. So most frameworks probably don't consider accessibility very much. I've got this slightly complicated diagram on screen, but if the amount of work the framework puts into accessibility is kind of that green bar going from bottom left to top right. So top right, the framework has put in lots of work to make the framework accessible. Say like the GDS components, that's a good example. There is still a gap. Even when the framework is really good, you have to know how to use it. You can use the best framework in the world, but if the developer isn't aware of, certain structural things like headings and alt text and certain things, then there's going to be a gap and they can use it really poorly. However, at the other end of the graph, if the framework hasn't done any work to make it accessible, that puts lots of work, lots of knowledge requirement onto the developers to get an accessible product out of it at the end. I come across a lot of product owners, project managers who just assume they seem to have this architectural assumption. Architects, they get trained, they know how to build wheelchair access and that sort of thing. Designers and developers must go through that process, surely. Unfortunately not. I run a lot of training. maybe 10% of people will put their hand up when I say, has anyone done any accessibility training before? 10% is about average. So that just means 90% of people coming into the workforce don't know, anything in practical terms about accessibility. Another sort of I don't know what I don't know sort of thing is developers, particularly if your task is to create, a carousel or a navigation widget, first thing you'll do is going to grab an example from somewhere. It's either provided by the framework or you just grab it from a Google search. And it really helps to just add accessibility to that Google search so that you get something that has at least considered accessibility. But yeah, there's a definite area where people tend to grab poor code when it comes to this. And another sign that you've got a little bit of knowledge in the organization, but it's not consistent, is say QA people, testers might be finding accessibility issues. And it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling problem almost because those issues often come from how the thing was designed in the first place. So you create this negative feedback loop where those issues get found pretty much at the end of development. And it's a bit like, a scenario where you've got one goalkeeper, there's loads of balls being shot towards them, and it turns into an impossible task. And, that way burnout lies, essentially. So it's something that you have to watch out for in the kind of early stages of maturity. Um, Once you go through, say, training and the awareness goes up and everyone gets involved, it's a bit more like, the somebody's taking a free kick towards your goal and the whole team is standing in front of it, instead of just the lonely goalkeeper. Another thing I've come across that's, it's a sign of sort of going up the maturity levels, but not sort of quite there yet, is when you might have one or two sort of developers who essentially clean up after everyone else. So they know their accessibility stuff, but the general teams don't. So every kind of third or fourth sprint, they go in and try and fix everything, which is both soul destroying for those developers, but also not very efficient. Start off with the training program, get everyone trained up so that they're not creating those issues in the first place. Another sort of sign of stepping up but not getting there quite yet is relying on automated tools. So we run everything through this tool and we fix those things, not realizing necessarily that tools don't find everything. Computers, despite AI advances, still do not know what is appropriate. You can have an image of a dog and call it a cat. You can call a button, and that will generally pass all the automated checks, not telling you that it's a delete button. Something else I've come across is when the front enders are the accessibility champions. And what often happens is they keep complaining about the designs. So the designers might be coming up with, say, templates, and I've got a screenshot from the NHS website from a few years ago. And I was working with one of their project teams, and we went through an exercise of kind of marking up their pages with what the best structure would be. And it just made the designers realize that the templates were really not consistent between certain areas, which is what was causing the front enders headaches. So once we sort of brought that exercise forward in terms of structuring the pages, it really kind of smoothed out that process. And then also little things like, do you use sort of native select drop downs? Do you create custom ones? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with creating custom ones, but it just implies more work for the front enders. And that needs to be accounted for when you go into that process. Another thing I come across is like, yeah, we're really into accessibility. Our colleague Stefan, he's a screen reader user. Let's run everything past him, which is not a bad thing to do. It's not sufficient and may lead to Stefan complaining about things, because that's not necessarily his job. So it's sort of a useful fallback maybe, but it's not something that you would rely on. I've also got just a personal bugbear. There's no such thing as alt tags. Alt text is alt is an attribute on the image. So that's just one of those little things I know when people have a little knowledge, they start talking about things. If they say alt tags, I kind of peg them about there. If they say alt text or the alt attribute, I put them up a peg. Um, then we get to the sort of started but overwhelmed, and this is where there's been testing done, but that knowledge in the sort of product teams isn't necessarily matched by sort of a recognition of a strategy being needed at the top. So we need to sort of recognize where to put the effort. And usually that's going to be into new things and new updates rather than working through a backlog of stuff that hardly gets used. And a kind of a related point to that is the sort of legacy systems. Sometimes you're dealing with really outdated technology. I'm afraid there's no sort of magic answer here. It's a case of balancing up. Well, we probably can't fix this legacy system. It's essentially going to come down to a procurement bit, a procurement sort of thing. We'll have to get a new system at some point. And it's just balancing what accommodations you might need to make for people in the meantime versus the cost of that new system. But also realizing that incorporating accessibility when you know how is very little sort of extra effort when it's done as part of the design process. But post-launch, you might be looking at re-implementing the entire interface. So the sort of costs really spike after that initial bit. And I have to give a hat to Lisa Anderson at Booking.com, who came up with some stats for this from their internal metrics. And then we sort of get on to integrated. And the things I notice when an organization is starting to integrate accessibility better is things like sprint demos being done without a mouse or a trackpad. They're using their keyboard, maybe even using some assistive technology, just as they demo standard features as they go along. Another good sign is if people are focusing more on their kind of design system and basically anything to do with systematic design, components, um, those sorts of things. If you've got solid components to start with, it makes everyone's life much easier. So the more mature the organization, the more likely they are to have figured that out. Maybe not even for accessibility reasons, but it really helps on the accessibility side as well. Another thing you might notice is developers and testers start coordinating their approaches. So in some organizations we work with, they've got most of the developers on Macs. So they might use one set of technology like VoiceOver. And then the testers need to be sort of getting a bit more coverage of different assistive technologies. So they coordinate and they might have either a Windows computer or a Windows virtual machine, and they'll standardize on NVDA and the sort of Windows-based technologies for their testing. And then another sign of a good sort of integrated organization is they start to work more from usability testing because they've got those technical issues out the way. They've done their audits, they've worked through their backlog. Obviously that still needs doing for new work, but they start using usability testing as a more important method because that's finding a wider range of issues, things that aren't necessarily covered by the guidelines, things that are more contextual to their situation or to their users. And that is where you sort of want to get to in terms of being on the front foot from an accessibility point of view. And then the kind of Zen level, that's where you get organizations, and I think organizations like Apple and the BBC come to mind, where they're publishing results from accessibility or creating new technologies for people to use on their platform, which just means you're really very much on the front foot in terms of accessibility. So that all sounds good, I hope. What might you be able to do about it? Well, there are various maturity models, accessibility related maturity models available. I've popped in a link well, I'll pop in a link later to the W3C one because it's not trying to sell you anything. Um, so it is quite a useful one to sort of keep in mind. And that really helps you to identify the gaps between the sort of current capabilities and where you might want to move to. And and compared to guidelines, a maturity model is going to be better for supporting an organizational approach compared to, focusing on which bits of the interface are broken. And as you go through that kind of experience journey, there are a few things, shortcuts and things you can look out for. So when I sort of start off in an organization who want to improve their accessibility, you've got some things that are top down. So we'd be looking to set a board level responsibility, somebody like head of digital or somebody who might be the person at board level who's responsible for accessibility, not expert, but a point of escalation. We want to start setting team responsibilities, hopefully individual targets, and some mechanism for monitoring progress. That's the top-down things. But we also need to work, almost more importantly, is bottom up. We need the product teams to have a good understanding and good skills. We can work through developing quite granular responsibilities. So designers need to do this, developers need to do these things. We want to encourage pattern usage and any kind of systematic design. And as you go through that, one of the first questions is like, so how do I persuade the senior person at my organization that I need to persuade? And I quite like Jared Spool's tweet here, there's only 5 things execs care about: increasing revenues, decreasing costs, increasing new business or market share, increasing revenue from existing customers, or increasing shareholder value. I think a couple of those are going to be more applicable in higher education, like decreasing costs, or improving existing customers' experience. But there is usually 1 or 2 buttons that you can press. So it might be you're gathering more students, it might be you're meeting kind of legal compliance, or it might be, there might be a corporate social responsibility policy that you can hook into that helps to kind of press that button. One of the tools we sometimes use is just if you take, say, 100,000 people, pop it into, or however many students you have, pop it into this how many website, and it comes up with all these kind of stats that typically out of 100,000 people, there'll be 21,000 who have a disability, 9,000 who are dyslexic, 3,000 who are blind or partially sighted. It just puts actual numbers on things. It's all based on, UK statistics, but type in, your number of students, your potential audience, and you can go from there. It gives you something quite concrete. Another thing I recommend is knowing where you stand. On the screen, I've got basically it's a spreadsheet from when we were working with the NHS, and they had about sort of 10 products that they were trying to look at, and we had a mix of automated and manual testing. Interestingly, in the top section, we've got I think about a dozen sort of criteria that came up when we were doing the automated testing. In the bottom section, we had another sort of 15-ish that were not found by the automated testing, were found by the manual testing. But the main principle is just to get a flavor of, for your digital estate, what are the worst offenders, what are the good places, what are the what's working well, what doesn't work so well, what needs the work and needs the attention. So you need to know where you stand. And unfortunately, a lot of clients we work with might have quite a simple, they've got a website run by a content management system, they've got their design system backing that up, they've got one set of content authors and developers who are feeding into that website. Universities, higher education tend to be much more fragmented with many websites, many systems, many sets of authors and developers. So you are in a tougher position from that point of view. It's also good to have other kind of sources of accessibility feedback. So if you can set up or find anything around direct feedback from students and teachers, like if you've got any central help or support staff, asking them about what sort of accessibility issues come up, any kind of online feedback, if you have searches set up for negative feedback, or setting up your own mechanisms, putting a link on the website to say if you need accessibility support, please let us know. Or usability testing, research in terms of how well students can use certain things. And I talked about granular responsibilities. This is like a workshop we quite often run with a product team to say we'll run through essentially the guidelines. It's really good to tack this on after you've run training. Um, and particularly, when we did it for the NHS, there were 10 guidelines that never came up. They didn't come up in testing. They just wouldn't come up because of the approach that those product teams took. So we just put those to one side. They're kind of policy things that we don't need to worry about. And then the content designers were responsible for 13 things, the graphic designers for 17 things, and then the testers were responsible for kind of testing everything. So if you can then produce a really cut down set of guidance for different roles, it makes it much more digestible for them. It would be lovely to do that universally, but unfortunately, different organizations put these responsibilities in different places. So it's not something we can do centrally very easily. But there is a lot of research around, particularly in the medical field, that if you've got guidelines or checklists, if the people who use them have ownership of them, they are more likely to use them. So, um, one of the creators of this sort of medical checklist used before operations said that each hospital should customize it. They were 95% the same, but the 5% made it work for them. Every one of these hospitals thought that theirs was best. So guidelines, for WCAG, they have to be universal. That's not the best way to use them, though. So do try and customize them with some experience. You can reword and customize them to your context. There are probably a dozen pages in terms of information relationships, how to do headings and that sort of thing. And you can condense that to 2 paragraphs. Here is how we use headings in our template. And it's so much simpler to do that. It also helps to create sort of a customized version for each format. So if you've got a PowerPoint checklist versus InDesign versus web, they're going to have different approaches to each kind of format. So it helps just to customize those, and you'll find it's going to be a much shorter list as well. Training is really key, both in terms of practical skills, but also in terms of awareness. We run things like a 15-minute awareness session that goes across a whole company or organization, followed up by specific role-based training, and things that can be kind of videoed and have handouts and resources. That's a good kickstart to an accessibility program. And then customizing, I said this point already, sorry, the sort of headings aspect, instead of multiple pages, customize it to the things you want. And that's essentially what we did when working with the NHS on their accessibility guidance for their service manual. So it's, that was their version of it. And it's useful kind of plain language exercise as well. And a key thing, if you're working in a product team, is making it part of the acceptance criteria and or part of being done. There is a bit of a skill that does require some experience in terms of what things should go into acceptance criteria. But having something about accessibility in both of those areas is a really good sort of starting point. And also being able to iterate. So if you can set up a shared design system, ideally with a component library, every time a project is run, that should be updated. And I think that's why I'm such a big fan of the GDS components, is they have lots of different departments using them. When they hit problems, they need new things, or they find accessibility issues, that gets fed back in. So it creates more of a kind of a virtuous circle in terms of building and progressing with accessible output. And government aren't the only people doing that. eBay, Sainsbury's, ING, these are all organizations that have specifically worked on accessible components. So by all means, borrow, copy, steal. They'll be very happy for that to happen. And internally in an organization, um, having some sort of distributed network that can tackle distributed tasks is really useful. So an accessibility champions network is the usual approach to this. So you might have members of that network through different product teams, through different departments. You want a mix of responsibilities, but primarily you want coverage of the organization. Um, Hopefully there's an accessibility sort of team or person who can organize this, and it's very much almost like a program manager type of role. Ideally you have a senior sponsor like your head of digital who turns up to the first meeting and gets everyone interested in turning up. But then after that they would be responsible for things like updating your accessibility guidance, or keeping an eye on sort of monitoring, answering questions, being a point of escalation. So this is a way of just a mechanism of having a community of people that are interested and work on accessibility through the organization. So that's generally my sort of organizational advice. Find a senior sponsor, work out where you stand, work out the granular responsibilities, document your approach and your version of the guidelines, get people trained up in that, and then try and create a process for keeping all of that up to date. And I went through that a little bit quickly, but hopefully that has generated some interesting questions, which I haven't looked at yet.
Absolutely perfect. I, for one, have made a lot of notes, just saying. So we do have a few questions. One is if we can share your slides and we'll get the links put out to everybody along with the recording and things like that. So don't
Yeah.
worry, people, we'll get that done because there was loads of good stuff in there. So I'll start off. Please, if anyone wants to ask Alistair a question directly, just raise your hand and we'll get to you. But first up in the chat pane with a question was Matthew. And Matthew asked, with PS Bar removing references to EN 301549 and changing to Web Content Accessibility Guidelines in 2022, do you think this potentially loses something? For example, the original directive refers to the EN chapters 9 and 10 and 11, that's software, non-web documents and web, that are not directly referenced in WCAG. So do you think we're going to lose a little something with that change? That's a
And if
deep question, Matthew,
it,
just saying.
good question. I think the short answer is I don't know. I also don't know if people are going to notice the difference. I mean, when we get asked to test things, it's generally test to WCAG. I mean, people will even say that if we're doing mobile app testing. So I don't know that there'll be that much difference. So sorry, tough question. I'm not sure.
No, I think that's a fair representation for that answer. And Matthew is saying great presentation, so he loves it, even though that was a tough question. We also have a question from Mike. Mike asked, and I wish I'd put some sort of bet on for this question to come up because I would have raked in so much money. And many people slash organizations are pinning their hopes on AI as a solution for developers and users. Can you comment on this, please? So there we go.
Yeah, and that's been a hot topic of conversation recently.
Yeah.
So there are potentially really useful things that it can do, and there are already demos of things like automatic alt text descriptions. There's seeing AI and things like that as well. I'll tell you what we're doing from a WCAG point of view in WCAG 3, which is that we are trying to allow for that future without relying on it. So we're trying to write WCAG 3 in a way that as somebody creating a website, take alt text as a simple example. Actually, it's not a very simple example. But anyway, as an author, your images should have alt text, and there is some guidance on what kind of alt text to provide for each kind of image. Um, a method that could be used is essentially to sort of not bother as an author with alt text and rely on the user agent to provide it. That's a potential option in future, but we're going to have to work through what we call the sort of accessibility supported side of it, which means do your audience actually have that technology? Was it William Gibson who said, the future's here, it's just not equally distributed? So we have no idea whether that kind of technology is going to be available to the people who need it in a sort of cost-effective approach. And maybe if you're running a university intranet and you provide the technology to your users, then maybe you can rely on that, and that would be fine. Um, but in the meantime, for the general public, it's not something I would be relying on.
Good answer. I like that. Yeah. I particularly liked, Alistair, the allowing for it but not relying on it line. I will be stealing that and using that in the future. And we've got a question from Steph. Mike, I'll just do Steph's question first and then so hold that thought, Mike. Um, any good examples, Steph asks, any good examples of accessibility checklists or ways of working in quotations that are academia specific? For example, we are currently looking at how best to implement inline citations with online journal articles. Quite HE specific. Any projects you can highlight, sharing knowledge on this kind of thing. So, if you know any of that off the top of
Um,
your head.
Not offhand. I'll have a little think about that. I know we did some work with it was a physics journal a while ago who and on we were helping them with their whole kind of publication process from what was it, latex through to web and PDF and things. And I know they did tackle citations and MathML and those kind of things. So if I'll look up that that website in a second because there might be some useful examples. Um, I also know AbilityNet do a HE specific maturity model that you might want to look into. That comes up if you Google it pretty quickly. Um, but I don't know of particular checklists of things. Again, it will vary depending on what tools people use, what your context is, what kind of content you produce. So it is a really useful process to go through taking the full list of guidelines and just working through which of these are actually applicable to your context. It's a good learning exercise, and actually the process of creating your own checklist is a good thing to do.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed. Mike, do you want to
Yeah,
unmute yourself?
you talked about the users, but I was also interested in the developers, and you touched on the point about searching for code and not searching for accessible code. But I think nearly all companies now are using generative AI to generate code, and I think there'll be fewer and fewer people trained in this area, and the assumption is you'll ask it to generate accessible code. What's your view on that?
Um, I'd go back to garbage in, garbage out. So if you assume that, most code on the internet isn't accessible, and if that's what it's learning from, what it produces isn't going to be accessible. There was a company I won't name, who created, here's our generative AI for creating accessible code, and then people poked holes in it in seconds. Um, it wasn't doing a very good job. I think it was based on a previous version of ChatGPT. Um, and to be honest, I've had this discussion online, but I don't know what a well, I think almost a decision tree approach is better than a generative AI. Just like, is this thing a table? Is this, just going down, what is the thing that you're producing? And there are, if you look at the ARIA patterns, you're going to get, at least some reasonable examples, ways of doing things. If there was a way of plugging those in and steering the machine learning to sort of use that more effectively, it might work. But I think in the meantime, that's going to be a downward slope until that problem is solved.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to put my hand up just before to admit that I am horrendous at pronouncing people's names. Like I'm really bad at it. So I'm going to go with Gayada. Is that
Jada,
right?
can you hear
Okay.
me? Hi.
I'm so sorry. I'm
No worries.
butchering your name.
It's difficult here in the UK, so no worries.
Thank you. Please ask your question.
Yeah, so just a quick one. As an organization, we are trying to move away from PDFs, so hot topic. But for some things, we are having to allow them. So our challenge at the moment is trying to make them, create policy and some guidance for ourselves first as a central content team, and then for others in the organization as to what is needed for a PDF to be as accessible as it can be. So I'd be interested, Alistair, if you have like any advice on this. First of all, do you think there's such a thing as an accessible PDF? And if so, any good guidance online or any checklists that could help us in the huge task? Thank you.
Yeah, there's several levels of problems, unfortunately. So PDFs can be accessible, but because there are so many PDFs that aren't accessible, people with disabilities tend not to trust them. So if I've literally seen it where people go in usability testing, oh, it's a PDF, it's not going to be accessible. I'm not even going to load it. I'm not even going to click on that link. So you have a perception problem, apart from anything else, which you may be able to solve if you can persuade your users. You've also got a potential bottleneck problem in that if you've got a web content management system, you've got authors using one interface, and you can sort of put restrictions on that. You can support them in, you basically put sort of guardrails in that make it more likely accessible content comes out. With PDFs, it's very dependent on the source. And because anyone can create a Word document, a PowerPoint, they can use their own whatever, system to create that PDF. It means it's really fragmented. So where we've worked with organizations, it tends to be a case of let's work on some accessible Word templates, maybe PowerPoint templates, and people are forced to use those in order to get it published, because otherwise they'll go off and do their own thing. And then you need some quite specific training. And one of the kind of previous slides I had, these bits are actually just I copied out of a document. I've got a PowerPoint checklist, and it's got just less than 10 items. An approved template is used. Only the built-in layouts have been used. Each slide has a logical order of content blocks. Each image has suitable alt text. And we've got less than 10 things here that are really specific to the templates and the context of those authors. So, as I said, creating your own kind of essentially checklist is useful. And unfortunately, it is a task that has to be done within the organization, because every organization has different things. I mean, in this particular case, we were trying to deal with PowerPoints importing from data from Excel and then exporting to PDF. So it was a really painful project. I'm not sure there is a great solution. We were checking things like actually which is better, the Acrobat PDF producer or the built-in Microsoft one, which came out with better tags, and it was 50-50, and there was always work to do on the PDF. So you're potentially also creating a bottleneck where if you actually want a good PDF coming out, the authors can take it so far, but then somebody with Acrobat Pro or Common Look or something like that will have to finish it off. So that's why GDS say don't use PDFs, use another format. It's because it is a lot more work because it is so distributed.
Yeah. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so we have this will probably be our last questions, but please do fire more in the chat if you have more questions, because I think this is going to have be our last one time-wise. So Chris had the question, as an educational institution, what is expected when vetting third-party systems that we buy in? We ask for their accessibility statements as part of our due diligence, but should we be carrying out our own vetting even if we receive this? We don't have necessary experts internally to do this. Would public sectors be expected to source external consultations to carry this out before we purchase an online system or platform? So what process would you or what approach would you recommend?
Yeah, something to talk about with your procurement people, because people tend to fall into a trap of, oh, well, we'll just have to test everything that we might buy. So that creates a huge amount of, frankly, unnecessary testing, because it would be much better if each product was tested once and then you just pass the results on. Until that utopia, I find the best way is asking them a process question. What steps do you take to ensure that your product is accessible? And it doesn't matter so much if you understand the answer. It's almost like a measure of honesty. If they say, "Oh no, we just make everything WCAG compliant," they're lying. But that's not how it works. So what you're looking for is a more honest answer that says, well, we have this process in place where we have these checks, and then we try and ensure that by our next, delivery of the product, that those previous things have been fixed. There must be some kind of feedback process there. And it's almost like as I said, a basic question of honesty. Do they actually tell you the answer, or do they just claim it's accessible? In which case, we know it's not.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Well, please don't quote that.
No, it's all right. It's okay. Yes, so that we're down to the last 5 minutes. So if anybody wants to, we could maybe squeeze another question, but we'll just leave it there just now, and we'll probably just answer the questions afterwards if there are any more questions. Kelly's obviously on the same wavelength as I am, where the dynamic duo. On the topic of PDFs, I will say that we do have our June clinic is PDF and Adobe and their APIs and things like that. So come along next month for PDF kind of chat. Alistair, you are more than welcome to come along to that too if you have time. I know you're a very busy man. And on that note, thank you so much for coming along and just sharing your knowledge and answering the questions and just being a fantastic guest speaker. Thank you so much. There's already been lots of things in the chat saying great presentation and thank you so much. So it's been really brilliant to have you along. And there's more popping in. So lots and lots of thanks and praise. So it's been brilliant. I don't think we've got lots of things that we need to catch up on. We will put the recording of Alistair's presentation out. We will get the captions done for that. We will put all the links into a document for you so that we get all of Alistair's, we'll wring every bit of knowledge out of the poor man after today, and all the links that he shared with us, as well as the ones that you guys have been sharing within the chat, because you've once again been phenomenal at answering and passing on and sharing information within the chat. So I just want to say thank you again. If there is anything you want to add, Kelly, please do so. But yeah, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for all your input, and thank you, Alistair.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks. And anybody, just so you know that in the chat, we've been popping some other things that might be of interest. Edward's popped in something that our AI at Jisc team is doing, I think tomorrow, which is a training event about AI and accessibility. And we've also got a meetup on AI and accessibility in a different context next week. And I've mentioned there as well, they came up, we've got Adobe at 4 p.m. First Wednesday in June, and that's because they're joining us from, I assume, California, so because they can't do it earlier. So have all your PDF Adobe questions ready for them, because we're going to take you straight to the the PDF horse's mouth for that one. So yeah, I look forward to seeing you there. In the meantime, carry on the conversation and communities. Thanks, Alistair. I really enjoyed that, and Laura for organising all of this and facilitating. That was fab. Top fun.
All
See you
right.
next time, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.